I want to spend more time talking about food, because I think that's the bigger concern that a lot of people have. Maybe we'll get back to houseplants and cover that a little bit. Houseplants is probably a little bit more complicated than it needs to be for what people are actually going to do. But I think people want to know about food. That's like the bigger concern. We spoke about trees and everything that needs to happen well in advance of Shemitah of the 7th year. So now let's talk about what happens once the 7th year comes around. So when the 7th year comes around, there's a few things. First of all, the land becomes ownerless. Now, when we say the land becomes ownerless, it's everything for the sake of the fruits that are on the land. So it doesn't mean you can live on someone's property during the 7th year. It means the fruit on the property or the crops or whatever it is become ownerless, and the land becomes ownerless to the extent that you need to use it to access their fruits or vegetables or crops or whatever it is. Okay? So the land becomes ownerless, the fruits. There's a few other things, Torah level prohibitions as well. The function of the fruit, it takes on what's called Kedushat Shivi. It has a level of sanctity. And because it has a level of sanctity, you can't just do whatever you want with it. It's sanctified for a certain use. So for the most part, that use is eating. We'll see that there are other things that can be done with them depending on what the produce is. But for the most part, they're sanctified for eating, so you can't do things other than eat with those fruits. That also means that, for example, the sanctity can be transferred to other things. We'll see that as well. The next thing is that we mentioned you can't use them you can't do commerce with the fruits of Shvis. So if you go and you gather Shvis fruits, there's a prohibition to sell them. It's a disagreement whether it's a Torah level prohibition or a rabbinic level prohibition, but there's a prohibition of selling Shemitah fruit. The other thing is, it's also a machloket, whether it's a Torah level or rabbinic, is something called biur. Biur is going to have important ramifications later during the Shemitah year. Even if a person does not have Shemitah produce in their house, but it will affect the produce in a store they might go shopping in, for example. And biur is that you're only supposed to have in your house whatever is still thriving in the fields. And when the fruits run out in the fields, you have to take them out of your house, anything that you have stored. So we'll see that you have to be mafkir a certain produce at a certain point during the 7th year, and someone who did not do biur, that food becomes prohibited.
Things that are dried or canned or frozen
also fall into the category of biur.
So, for instance, you can't.
So, classic
you
example.
Can make jam.
A big thing. No, you can make jam, but you have to do biur with it. So, the classic example, I think, which everybody runs into, is wine, right? Because some people who won't necessarily buy otzer beis din, which we'll talk about otzer beis din later on, but a lot of people do buy otzer beis din wine. So, people have otzer beis din wine in their house. When it comes to the time of biur, you have to be mafkir. Now we'll see that you yourself can acquire it again later, but you have to do a real hefker with it. You really have to be mafkir. Okay, on a Torah level, we spoke about sfichim briefly. We'll go back into that, which was a prohibition the rabbis made to discourage people from trying to be sneaky, planting things in the 7th year and pretending that it was from the 6th year. And there's another rabbinic prohibition of taking Shvis foods out of Eretz Yisrael, out of the land of Israel, and going with them to Chutz La'aretz. So we'll see that if someone needs to go on vacation or whatever and they're leaving Eretz Yisrael, you should not take food with you which have a sanctity of the 7th year. If you need to, you could take some for the plane ride, but you can't bring it with you to Chutz La'aretz. Okay, so now the question is, what makes a fruit have the sanctity of the seventh year? Because not every fruit, or let's say this, not every plant will have a seventh year prohibition upon it, and not every part of the plant will have the sanctity of the seventh year. It has to be the fruit of whatever this thing is, meaning whatever product comes from it. So first of all, it's going to depend what type of fruit are we talking about. It's going to be very important when the fruit began to blossom or sprout or reach a third of its growth, whatever it is. It's going to depend who owns the land that those plants are growing on. And also geographically, where is it located? Right? There are certain things that we might consider Israel, which are not halachically part of the land of Israel. And things only have the sanctity of Shemita if they have they're in the halachic borders of the land of Israel. So let's start with what type of thing actually receives the sanctity of Shemitah. So any food which is consumed by people, but also foods which are consumed by animals. So there are certain things which are grown only for animal consumption, not for human consumption, but we also derive benefit from that, so those foods also have the sanctity of the seventh year. Anything which people use for anointing, so for example, oils could also have sanctity of the seventh year, even oils meaning not oils which are made for consumption, oils which are made for anointing. Lighting, anything, oils that you can use for lighting, for example, lighting candles, right? If the function is for lighting, you can use them for lighting. And anything people use for coloring, specifically like people use it for makeup or for pottery and different vessels like that, although that's probably less common nowadays, certainly not for the average person. And then anything which gives off a scent. We paskin, l'chomer, we're stringent that any scent bearing like flowers and things like that do have the sanctity of the seventh year. Okay? So those are the things that give a plant sanctity of the seventh year. That's on the type of produce that it is. The second thing is, when did this plant or fruit or vegetable sprout or come to maturity? So we spoke about the fact that fruits go by when the flower falls off and the fruit begins to grow, it's called chanata, right? Whenever the fruit begins to emerge on the tree, whatever year that happens in, that is the year that fruit has sanctity. So if that's in the 6th year, so then even though it's growing to maturity and you only take it off the tree on the 7th year, it's still a 6-year fruit. So this is something that a lot of people have to realize, that we're going to talk about shopping and fruits and vegetables and Shemitah now, but very few things will you actually feel the impact of them right away. Because a lot of the fruits that you'll be eating at the beginning of the 7th year and vegetables will all be from the 6th year anyways, and there's no questions whatsoever. So you have a few months before it starts with vegetables, because right, fruits take a longer time to reach maturity. So it'll be a few months before you actually feel or have to start dealing with these questions. Vegetables, assuming that they don't have a problem of sfichim, which again we only mentioned briefly last time, go by the time that they are picked. Whenever the vegetable is picked, there is an opinion which people try to be stringent for, that it's when the vegetable comes to full maturity, even if it's not yet picked, that's the year, that establishes what year it's in. If it's a 6th year, 7th year, or 8th year vegetable, when it gets to full growth or when it's picked. Good. Also, olives, grapes, and standing crops like beans and grains and all of these things, different grasses, all go by a third of their expected height. That's considered, but that's whatever year they attain that height. That's when if they reach that in the 6th year, then they're 6th year. If they reach it in the 7th year, then it's 7th year. Okay.
Even if it's not taken in the 6th year.
That's right. Even if you take it in the 7th year,
it's a 6th year.
It's a 6th year
food.
That's why when we talk about fruit being ownerless and all these things, well, it really depends, right? If you walk into someone's garden, you don't realize that it's 6-year fruits, and you're just stealing. You know what I'm saying? They don't have any sanctity of the 7th year. You have no right to take it.
Right.
Yeah. So it really depends on.
Do people post?
We'll get to that. You should post, and we'll talk about that in a second.
At the beginning of the 8th year, there's also a problem with Shemitah.
That's right. Shemitah doesn't just end once the 7th year is over. Right. At the beginning of the 8th year, you have a lot of produce in the market, which is still Shemitah produce, even though it's the 8th year. Okay, good. Now, Hefker. Exactly the question Reb David was asking. It's a machloket between the Mabit and the Beit Yosef. The Mabit was the Beit Yosef's main student in Tzvat on the Hefker process. According to the Beit Yosef, there's a mitzvah, there's a Torah commandment that says that you have to actively rest your land. And the Beit Yosef understands that means that you have to do the Hefker process yourself. Meaning, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, that means a proper Hefker. You sit in front of 3 people, you make a verbal announcement, and you say, I'm being mafkir, I'm making ownerless my produce. If you do not do that, according to the Beit Yosef, you are transgressing this mitzvah. The opinion of the Mabit is that it happens automatically, whether you don't have to say anything. The Torah said it's going to happen, it happens. Now, so the important difference is that if a person did not declare it, according to the Beit Yosef, then his fruit is still owned by him. He's transgressing, but the fruit isn't ownerless until he makes the hefker. But according to the Mabit, it happens automatically, and whether he likes it or not, that fruit is hefker. And so what that would mean is that... okay, good. This is a different question. Okay, fine. There is a second machloket between the Beit Yosef and the Mabit, one that's going to have more ramification to our everyday life. According to the Beit Yosef, it's a whole question of whether or not non-Jews can make an acquisition in the land of Israel on the land. According to the Beit Yosef, land owned by non-Jews is not connected in any way to the process of hefker, of Shemitah. There's no sanctity on the fruits that's grown on a non-Jewish farm, if the land is owned by a non-Jew. So all the produce he grows there, according to the Beit Yosef, is normal produce. It doesn't have any sanctity of Shemitah. According to the Mabit, it still has sanctity of the 7th year, and you have to treat it with all the sanctity of the 7th year. It's just then becomes a question of whether or not it's ownerless or not, right?
Just a question. Shemitah and Yovel have a certain relationship. Yovel, all the land returns to the original owners, in theory.
Yeah.
Right? Which means not Gentiles.
Well, you have to, Yovel is a process. You have to be able to acquire your land back. Yeah? First of all, for the sake of our discussion, there's no halachic ramification for Yovel nowadays.
I understand. But the principle of owning land, of permanently owning land for a non-Jew, how would that possibly work?
So that's all a Hilchos Yovel question. You have to go into the whole sugya of Goel. how you purchase lands during, how you get them back, and there's
Right.
really no halachic ramification to us today. So we're just going to
Okay.
set it to the side. For us, the Beit Yosef says that anything which is grown on a non-Jewish farm has no sanctity. The Mabit says it has sanctity. Now what happened is that the Beit Yosef was the posek for Eretz Yisrael, for the land of Israel, and the minhag in Eretz Yisrael was always to go like the Beit Yosef. It's also now it's the minhag Yerushalayim. The Chazon Ish argues with this, and he goes with the Mabit. He's not very happy with the position of minhag Yerushalayim. And like this, the Badatz Eida Charedis, for example, because they go like minhag Yerushalayim, sell nachri vegetables, meaning fruits and vegetables grown by non-Jews, are sold without any sanctity of the 7th year of Shemitah whatsoever, and so it's just like regular produce. Those who are stringent for the Chazon Ish, so B'nai Brakers, or in the past they sold through Sheretz Yisrael, which is a B'nai Brak Hechsher. Nachri has sanctity of the 7th year, and you have to treat it with the sanctity of the 7th year. Okay, we'll go into details of how we treat produce with the sanctity of the 7th year, but according to them, you have to treat it with the sanctity of the 7th year. So if you go, for example, to shopping at Osherat or whatever, they will mark specifically everything they're selling under what category it falls. If it's Otzer Beit Din, which we didn't speak about yet, it's Otzer Beit Din. If it's Nachri, they'll write Nachri. If it's Chutz La'aretz, they'll write Chutz La'aretz. And then there are certain parts of Eretz Yisrael where it becomes a machloket. They'll tell you if they're from those parts of Eretz Yisrael. An interesting thing is that if you hold that Nachri produce has no sanctity, and someone's coming to your house for Shabbat, or even for lunch during the week, whatever it is, Rosh Hashanah Zalman Auerbach says that you have to let them know if they're stringent about Nachri. So you have to tell them that this is produce of Nachri, and if you hold that there's sanctity, yeah.
Are the prices different?
Yeah, prices are different.
Prices are different for each of the categories.
Well, just based on the availability, right?
No, I mean if
it's from Chutz La'aretz, they're probably going to have to pay more money to bring it in.
I'm just wondering if the prices, do they disadvantage Jewish farmers at all, or is it meant to advantage them?
Okay, like this. There's a big concern for Jewish farmers during Shemitah because it's a very difficult time for them. There's something called Heter Mechira, which we're going to have to talk about because that's what most of the supermarkets are going to be doing. For the Haredi Ashkenazi world, where Heter Mechira does not exist, they want to encourage Jewish farmers to do Shemitah, and so they set up separate funds that they raise money for these farmers in order to be able to, survive during the Shemitah year when they're not selling their produce. Because they have to, it was one thing once upon a time, it was you just ate whatever was on the land. But a lot of these farmers have to pay for the property that they're on. So they need liquid cash. Yeah? So some people say, some of the poskim who rely on Heter Mechira are very against produce of Nachri, because they say that you're giving an advantage to the non-Jewish farmers. But if you hold that produce of Nachri is the best option that's out in the market, then you don't really have a choice. Okay, so that's why they raise money for them. We'll talk about that in a little bit as we get more into it. Okay, interestingly enough, even someone who generally follows the minhag of B'nai Brak, goes like the Chazon Ish, if he moves to Yerushalayim, he doesn't have to. He can follow the minhag of the place, which is go like the Badatz, and he could buy Nachri vegetables and fruits, and he doesn't have to treat them with sanctity of the 7th year. Okay, so we spoke about the type of produce, the time that it grows, who's growing it. Also, right, which parts of of Eretz Yisrael actually have sanctity of the seventh year. Interestingly, stuff from Transjordan has sanctity of the seventh year from a Torah level. Things which are grown in Syria, this is a fascinating halacha. Things which are grown in Syria have sanctity of the seventh year d'Rabbanan, on a rabbinic level. Why? Because back in the day, they wanted to discourage Jewish farmers from jumping over the border, growing produce in Syria, and then coming and selling it as chutz la'aretz fruits and vegetables. Nowadays, it's not a problem. But if you happen to know a Jewish farmer in Syria, you should just know that his food has sanctity of the seventh year d'Rabbanan. Okay, so let's just talk briefly about the hefker process. So we said that you have to, according to the Beit Yosef, actively be mafkir your produce. So anybody who has an orange tree or a lemon tree or a pomegranate tree, whatever it is in their backyard, has to actively say, I'm rendering this produce ownerless, and preferably we should do that in front of 3 people at the beginning of the seventh year. According to them, it happens automatically, but if he doesn't treat it like hefker, that's how he transgresses the mitzvah of making it ownerless.
Is that done at the time of prosbul?
When exactly you should make it ownerless?
Yeah.
That's actually a good question. Is it, you do it before Rosh Hashanah? Probably right before Rosh Hashanah would be my guess.
Is that the obligation of a tenant or a landlord if it's a
The
rental?
landlord. It's the obligation of the landlord, it's not the tenant. Okay, so like this. If you have produce, you have to make sure people have access to it. If you lock your gate, what that means is that you are not treating it like it's hefker. And that means that also, when you go to a field, if you go to a field of a Jewish farmer, a vineyard or an orchard or something, you can walk right in and you can take whatever you want, assuming that they're following the rules of Shivi. If not, you can't just do that. They become issues like we spoke about. But assuming that they made their land ownerless, it's an observant farmer, you can walk in and take whatever you want. Now, out of derech eretz, a person should let the owner know, hi, I'm here, I want to take some fruits and vegetables and not just walk through their field. Now, simultaneously, as a homeowner, if you have a fruit tree, you probably also don't just want people walking in and out at all hours. Also, if you're concerned about any vandalism or destruction of the land or the fruit tree, it's also one of those things that for farmers as well, right? They're worried that people are going to mess up the trees and the property and everything like that. If a person has such a concern, you can fence it, you can lock it, whatever it is, but you need to put up a sign that says this produce is hefker. If you would like to take some, call us between the hours. You can put a phone number, you can give hours, right? You can't have people walking in or calling you at 2, 3 in the morning. But you can say, it is ownerless, please call to set up a time where you can come and get access to the fruit. So yes, a person should put up a sign. Yeah.
This idea of hefker we're talking about. So you've been to my place, we have fruit trees and stuff there. So just come by and do, in your heart, just hey, anyone could just come by at any time, or should you just say, hey, put on a WhatsApp group, come at this time, to take my fruits, this is when I'm available, or is that...
So if your gate is open, for people to come in whenever they want, you don't have to put up a sign. But if you want to lock your gate, you have to put up a sign.
Do I have to go the extra effort and tell people?
Yeah.
I have to go out and say it.
You put the sign on your gate.
You have to make it known that this stuff is hefker. I was mafkir my stuff.
Right. So today, can we just throw a message on the WhatsApp?
You could put a message on WhatsApp. Sure.
You should be aggressive with it, every month. Hey, by the way, guys.
No.
Just one time, here we go.
I mean, people have to be able to know. That's the whole thing. You don't have to babysit people, but people have to be able to know. So I think the easiest thing is just to stick it on your front
I want
gate.
to go inside and whenever I want.
to Shlomo's house. That's yeah, of course.
Now, question: is it a hitter mitzvah to just gather all yourself and just deliver it to people? Like, let's say about 500. We have a lot of lemons that come up. So let's say I have 500 lemons. Like, is it a hitter mitzvah to go out?
So it actually runs into an issue, which is like this. We said that the mitzvah is to eat the fruit. And so therefore when a person comes and takes hefker produce, you cannot take more than you're going to eat.
Over what period of time?
So it's supposed to last you for 3 meals. Whatever would last your family for 3 meals, that's the amount of produce that you're allowed to take. So if you go to, like a orchard, we once went to an orchard that was participated in Otzar Beit Din, and we said, "Will you come and take?" And they said, "Yeah, of course." So you can't just come and fill up 5 baskets. You can only take whatever's going to last your family for 3 meals, because otherwise you're bringing the fruit to, it's going to come to rot, it's going to come to spoil, and you cannot actively bring fruits with sanctity of the 7th year to spoil. So, if Shlomo, you want to do it that way, what you should do is people should appoint you as a shaliach for them. If people appoint you as a shaliach, then there's no issue for taking for other families. That's also, we'll see with Otzar Beit Din, preferably if someone's going to bring you produce that has sanctity of the 7th year, you should appoint that person as your shaliach. So because that's what's going to allow them to take produce for multiple people. Okay?
That's a simple statement. You're my shliach.
Yeah, that's it. Sometimes they have a form, but you can say, "I'm appointing you my shliach," and that's
right.
Yeah.
Sorry, one other question. Is it the same thing if, let's say, I juiced all the lemon and then put them in bottles and then gave them to people that way? Like juicing the lemon?
Well, again, if you juice it, yeah, we'll have to talk about what happens with the peels and whether or not you can juice it. And there's a different conversation, but whatever the amount of juice that people would use for 3 meals, right? So it's also like with wine, if you take Otzar Beit Din wine, you should only take the amount that you're going to use for. I think they said that you can use it for the seder, the arba kossos for the seder for you and all your family members, which might end up being a lot. Yeah. Okay.
But you can take that amount all year long, or just at the time of the seder.
You can come back multiple times. What do you mean?
No, we said 3 meals, and when we said wine, you said that the definition is for the seder.
Yeah, all times.
But you only have a seder once a year.
Right.
Right. So on a Shabbos, can you take as much as you would take for the seder?
Yeah, because you could use that wine for the seder.
Right. Also, there are things that don't go bad. You can get apples that'll last you for
in the fridge
3 weeks.
for a long time. Sure.
I mean, they store apples and sell them 6 months later.
You're right. It's an interesting question, right? What happens about something that stores well and you're not worried about it coming to? Good question. Okay. Good. You can, by the way, interestingly enough, stop a non-Jew. I don't know if you would want to, but the verse says that it's lachem, that the hefker is for the Jewish people. And so you do not have to be mafkir your fruit to non-Jews. As a matter of fact, you cannot take non-Jews, have them take shvius out of your property. If you have non-Jewish workers working at your house or staying at your house, if they eat it on the premises, so you're hosting them, you can feed them, but you cannot have them take sanctity of shvius fruit off the property. Okay, so I want to start like this. So we spoke about basically fruits are going to be in the supermarket that don't have the sanctity of the 7th year, and there are going to be fruits in the supermarket that have the sanctity of the 7th year. So I think the most important thing we have to talk about, just because we have to talk about it, is heter mechira. Okay? So the majority of supermarkets, for sure up here in the north, rely on a leniency called heter mechira. Now, heter mechira was a leniency which was given by some of the greatest rabbis of a generation. But we have to make a distinction. The first rabbis who came out and made the leniency, or gave the leniency of heter mechira, were living in the land of Israel while it was still under Turkish Ottoman rule, or shortly after. And at that time, the financial situation for Jews in the land of Israel was extremely difficult. People died in the streets literally of starvation, of cholera. I don't know if people realize what it meant to live in the land of Israel, in the late 1800s. There's a reason why few people did it. It was not a popular destination because people literally died in the streets. At that time, many of the great rabbis came out. They signed a document allowing the farmers to participate in heter mechira. The concept of heter mechira is that the farmer is allowed to sell his land to a non-Jew, and the non-Jew can work it during the 7th year, and then he can purchase the produce from the non-Jew. Or him or anyone else can purchase the produce from the non-Jew, but the idea is that he can rent out, he doesn't rent out, he sells his farm for that year. Now, since that time, other Rabbanim have come out and permitted it. The most important one for our generation is Rav Ovadia Yosef. Rav Ovadia Yosef came out and said, yes, this is a legitimate thing. You can rely on heter mechira.
Can the non-Jew hire a Jew to work at that time, or no?
Can he hire the Jew back to work on the property?
Yeah.
So that's going to come into the question of whether or not it has sanctity of the 7th year or not, right? If the produce has sanctity of the 7th year according to the Mabid, then he's not allowed to work it. Mm-hmm. The non-Jew is not commanded; he's allowed to work it.
Right.
Right. Okay. Good. So, like this, it's important to note Rav Ovadia. The two things to note: Rav Ovadia himself writes in Yabia Omer that yes, you can rely on heter mechira, meaning it's a real thing. There's a halacha like that. But Rav Ovadia says that a person should not rely on it unless they have no other option financially. I mean, the other options available to them, they just can't afford it. That is where Rav Ovadia says to rely on heter mechira. That's what he says in Yabia Omer. There was, during the last Shemita cycle, it became a very political thing. A lot of people pushed heter mechira very strongly. Rav Ovadia's son, Rav Yitzchak Yosef, wrote a letter that Rav Margalit published 2 months ago. I can try to get it for people that want to see. But again, he says, don't rely on heter mechira, only as a last ditch. You don't have any other option. Okay, so Rav...
So machri is preferable than heter mechira?
It depends who you're going to ask, like we said, right? But yes, according to the mainstream Ashkenazi Haredi poskim, machri is your best option, or chutz la'aretz. So like this. So that's one thing to know. How Rav Ovadia is very specific about when he allows heter mechira. The second thing to know is even if we allow heter mechira, we have to understand the following thing. The concept of heter mechira works as follows. You sell your property, it belongs to the non-Jew. That's the only way it works. If it doesn't belong to the non-Jew, it doesn't work. Now, the challenge is that, let's say, for those of us who rely on selling chametz during Pesach, would be the same idea. I'm not allowed to own chametz during Pesach, but a non-Jew is allowed to own all the chametz he wants. So I'll sell him my chametz. Now, that sale is only valid if the non-Jew comes knocking on your door and says, I want all this bisli that you wrote in the contract. Where is it? If you're not willing to give him the bisli, you didn't make a sale. Right? Whiskey, whatever it is. Whatever you sold him, you have to be willing to give it to him. Otherwise, it's not a valid sale. This becomes a challenge when it comes to selling parcels of land. Most of us are happy to relinquish our ownership of our pasta and our bisli, but most of us. but would not be willing to relinquish the ownership of our property. Because if a farmer who sells through Heter Mechira, if the non-Jewish farmer who's buying the farm comes to him and says, I'm keeping it, I'm not giving it back to you, how many of the farmers would be willing to say, okay, a sale's a sale?
And there's no provision? Usually
it has to be a sale.
Usually there's a provision, or maybe I'm completely wrong about this, but I understood, when you're selling your chametz, there's a provision that there's an opportunity to purchase it back.
Sure, afterwards.
Yeah.
But he doesn't have to. He could decide he wants to keep it.
Well, if he ate the bizily, that's one thing, right? But let's say he took something that's on your list, right, of food, but he hasn't eaten it.
He paid for it.
He paid for it. But isn't there a provision to buy it back?
You can buy it back. I mean, that's what we do. We buy it back.
But isn't he required to sell it
No.
with that provision?
No. He doesn't have to sell it back to you.
So a person who sells their home when they leave town in Chutz La'aretz to come to Israel.
You're not
Pesach,
selling your home. Oh, you're talking about for Pesach?
Yeah.
You don't sell your home. You're selling the chametz in your home.
Okay.
Sometimes we rent out a part of the home so that the Rabbanim can make the purchase of all of the bread that's there, but you're not actually selling your property to the non-Jew.
Okay.
Okay? Okay. So that's the challenge with Heter Mechira, is that the way it's done, the farmers don't understand what's going behind the sale in a lot of the situations, and so therefore they'll sell off the property even though they might not actually be willing to sell their property. Okay, so that's the other challenge with Heter Mechira. If a person wants to rely on Heter Mechira, they should make sure that the body that's carrying out Heter Mechira is doing it in a way that the sale is genuine. Okay, so now that that's all on the table, that's Heter Mechira. The majority of supermarkets rely on Heter Mechira, certainly outside of the major from cities, like outside of Yerushalayim and Bnei Brak, and maybe places like, parts of Haifa, parts of Petach Tikva. Certainly here in Carmiel, this is Daniel Yitzchak's opportunity to bring in other produce for us, because up until now, Rami Levi, Supersol, it's Heter Mechira. Okay? Okay. So that means that wherever you go shopping, you should know what you're purchasing, if it's Heter Mechira, if it's coming from Chutz La'aretz. Meaning a person could go into Rami Levi and say, hey, these apples are from Washington, right? These are red delicious, and he can purchase those apples, and they're not going to have sanctity of the seventh year because they come from Chutz La'aretz.
So you can rely on Heter Mechira properly if you know for a fact that the transaction was legitimate, the sale was legitimate.
That's condition one. Okay. And Rabbi Vadi says condition two is that you really don't have a choice. Like, you can't afford to buy anything else.
So if you don't know if the transaction was legitimate, then aren't the supermarkets kind of performing a kind of a lifnei iver type of thing?
Well, it's like this, meaning
aren't they misleading?
It's always going to come back to the same question. It's a challenging question, like this. Everybody agrees it's better that all these farmers should be doing Heter Mechira than just transgressing Shemitah, right? Meaning, we're told by the prophet Jeremiah, by Yirmiyahu Navi, that part of the condition of us being here is that we observe the seventh year. And so certainly it's better that they rely on an existing leniency and that they're doing something than to just continue to work the land in a completely prohibited manner. But whether or not you should buy that produce, that's your choice, and you have to know what's out there and whether or not you should be buying it.
Well, isn't the problem, okay, I'm buying legitimate Heter Mechira, how's that and the problem, maybe it's not a legitimate Heter Mechira, I don't know that, how's that different than me walking into a kosher restaurant with certification, and I'm assuming that it's kosher, but, the avera is on them, not on me.
It's the same, it's not an avera, they're relying on a leniency. And the question is whether or not you should be relying on that leniency. And so that's the question that comes up with everything that the Rabbanut does in this country. The Rabbanut made a decision that it's better that everybody in this country should eat something that's kosher than things which are entirely treif. Does that mean that the leniencies they rely on are leniencies you should be relying on? Not necessarily, and some of the leniencies certainly not. Right? If they're leniencies that Ashkenazim don't follow, then you shouldn't be eating those things. Right? Like things that might have like we don't eat things that had a giranasha with nikor, even though the Rabbanut puts a hechsher on it, because why wouldn't they? Because Sfardim can eat it, right? So it's again, the consumer has to be educated in this country, and also should know that the Rabbanut does not put out things which are not kosher. But that does not mean that everything that comes out of the Rabbanut is something that you should be purchasing. Because it's better that people should be doing things at some level of kashrut than not keeping kosher at all. But you can be educated, and you can decide what level of kashrut you want to keep, where you feel is appropriate for you in your situation, whatever your situation is. Okay, good? Okay, so yes.
You brought up a couple things that in Osher Ad, for example, they have everything labeled.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, the Super Sol and Rami Levi rely on Heter Mechira.
But they'll tell you that. There'll be a sign that says it.
They're also labeled?
They're not going to label every product, but there'll be a big sign that says, we did Heter Mechira over here. And then the stuff which clearly not Heter Mechira, because it has a sticker, grown in France.
Okay, but that's up to us to determine. They're not going to put a sign that this is
That's right.
Chutz La'aretz,
And
this is not
that's right. And the Arab guy stocking the shelf may have no idea. He might know. Sometimes they know. The ones that the Arabs that work at Osher Ad are usually pretty good. They actually usually know where it comes from. But the one at Rami Levi might have no idea why you're harassing him about it.
What's the difference? Sorry.
I was just saying, so if we don't rely on Heter Mechira, essentially, unless we find specific things.
Well, you can
that
talk
we
to
know-
the Mashgiach there. Mashgiach at Rami Levi is great. Call him up, talk to him, he'll let you know what's what.
It's gonna be useful.
Yeah?
What's the difference between fresh produce and canned produce or jarred?
Well, there's no difference between them, just whether or not every piece of produce is going to either have the sanctity of a seventh year or not,
Right.
depending on where it's from and when it was, went through the process.
Right.
There's a different question of whether or not what you're allowed to can and pickle and all those things, but that's a whole different discussion when we talk about what happens when you have produce which has.
For instance,
sanctity of
things
a
were
seventh year.
canned in the 6th year and are on the shelves.
Then there's
No
6 years.
issue.
No issue.
Right. Okay.
For sure not. Look, you can continue, meaning even if there's a store that relies on Heter Mechira, there's plenty of things you can still buy there,
Right.
right? You just wouldn't want to buy the produce there if you're not relying on Heter Mechira, right?
Right.
Okay, so that means that the store that you go to should be through someone who's reliable for the halachas of Shemitah, that they're selling you things which they can tell you, this is from Chutz La'aretz, this is Nachri, right? This is Arava, if it grows in certain parts of the land of Israel, or this is Otzer Beitin. Okay, so I have no idea what time it is. How are we doing? Okay, so Otzer Beitin, we should just mention Otzer Beitin for a second. I don't know how hard or easy it will be to find Otzer Beitin produce in Carmel. Sometimes they sell it at Osher Ad, sometimes the yeshiva might arrange. In the past, the Mishnat Yosef sales have arranged it. I don't know if they're going to this year. Otzer Beitin works as follows. As we mentioned, you could technically find a farm which is run by an Orthodox farmer and come in and take whatever you want. Again, you should only take for your family. You should preferably take it off with the shinui if you need to cut the branch or anything like that. You should do it differently than the professional way in which they do it. Otzer Beitin was a concept that actually started. It was interesting how it started, how it sort of changed over time. It used to be actually that there used to be sort of like a Shemita police, which would stand at the entrance of the cities when people came in from the fields and make sure that they weren't taking more produce than they were allowed to take from the fields. And all the other leftover produce, they used to store it in a big otzar, and that's how I got the name Otzar Beitin, in a big storage house. And then they used to package that up, and then they used to, sell it at fixed prices. We'll talk about the prices in a second, to the masses. Nowadays, the way Otzar Beitin works is most people are not going to make it to the field. Right? You're not going to make it to the field to go picking fruits. So the Beit Din works with certain farmers to send out people to harvest on your behalf. And then they'll come and they'll bring their produce and they will sell. We'll talk about what they're selling exactly.
These are Jews that are harvesting?
Sure, they can hire whoever they want. It doesn't matter. They're shluchei Beit Din. These are the shluchim of the Beit Din. And not only that, the Chazon Ish says that they can harvest it in the regular way. They don't even have to use a shinui when they do it, right? They can take large amounts for people. They don't have to restrict it. Know exactly who they're.
So you can have a regular
for.
harvest.
It looks basically like a regular harvest, with the exception that you're not allowed to sell produce of the 7th year. So they are not allowed to charge you for the produce. So what do they charge you for in Otzar Beit Din? They charge you for the labor. They charge you for the transportation. They charge you for materials. All those things they're allowed to charge you for. I can't tell you what it's going to look like, Otzar Beit Din, this year. When we were living in Yerushalayim, Otzar Beit Din was considerably cheaper than the other options. You would come back with a big packet of mangoes or avocados for like 12 shekels. Right? Here you pay 12 shekels for one avocado if you're lucky. Right? I'm saying, right? So Otzar Beit Din should be cheaper. I don't know. I can't tell you what it's going to look like this year. There could be challenges with finding farms and whatever, which may change the prices. Right? I have no idea. But that's the idea of Otzar Beit Din. If a person wants to eat 7th year produce, that's a great option to go to. As we said, the Ramban holds that there is a mitzvah to eat it. It's not a requirement, but there's a mitzvah to eat 7th year produce. So the Chazon Ish says like this: it's not a requirement. You don't have to eat 7th year produce if you don't want to. You also don't have to make sure it's consumed. Like, if you have something that's going to go bad, then it goes bad. You just cannot bring it to be spoiled actively, meaning you can't take more than you need. You can't put it in a place where it's sunny or buggy or animals will get to it, because all those things are actively going to come to ruin the fruit, which we're not allowed to do because of the sanctity of the 7th year. Okay, so that is Otzar Beit Din.
Can I ask one more question about Otzar Beit Din?
Yeah.
Normally in a food process, the farmer doesn't sell the food to the consumer. It goes through some middlemen, wholesalers, stuff like that. And each one makes a certain percentage on the product. With Otzar Beit Din, you're not making money on the product. Are there middlemen at all, or
the people are getting paid for the work they put in, meaning someone's getting paid.
And how do you get that fruit actually, like the consumer?
So first of all, the Beit Din is the one who puts together the Otzar Beit Din.
Right.
So I don't know who's going to be doing it this year, but it used to be Rav Nissim Karelitz used to do a lot of it. There was the Otzar Beit Din of Rav Nissim, and they used to organize it from drivers to workers and the whole thing all through the Beit Din, and you just got the product and were told, this is how much it costs us to get the fruit to you.
So the answer to my question is there is no middleman in that situation. You're actually buying it from the Beit Din.
You're buying it from the Beit Din, and the Beit Din's paying.
You're not buying it from Osher
No.
with a sign that says Otzar Beit Din.
Oh, you're saying that, well, Osher Ad's gonna make money on it. Why? Because they have employees that have to put it out, and it's taking space on their shelves, and whatever commercial reasons they have to charge you for it, they charge you for the commercial reasons, right? You're not going to put the fruit in the store and take a loss because you have to pay workers for it and bags and whatever it is. So the Osher will get something for whatever their loss is going to be, to cover their losses for Otzar Beit Din.
Got it.
Yeah?
So if I buy Oster Bacon Osher, I just take the amount I need for 3 meals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. But for your whole family.
Oh, I see.
Not just for you, for your whole family. So for you, that would be, it's a nice amount.
So they take a lot, but it's still on us to just take 3 meals?
Yeah. Grab a nice amount, whatever would be appropriate for your family.
On Osher Odd, so if they mark all the fresh produce, do they do the same thing with the cans? The things that are canned, or they do not do that?
You have to check the cans.
So that they don't put those in sections?
That's on you. You have to check the cans. Yeah, I mean, you're not going to have to worry about the can. The problem is that these are the things where we don't think about them. The 7th year, you're not going to see any canned produce that has any sanctity or Shemitah. It's only going to come, in the 8th year, maybe even the 9th year. You have to be careful when you go shopping and actually look at things. And we'll see there's going to be 2 issues over here. People, if you go to a place which doesn't, it's not in line with the 7th year, person's not trustworthy about Shemitah, so a lot of these things they will not have done biur at the time of biur. Mm-hmm. And so you can't consume it. So you'll find Otzer Beitin wine on a shelf a year and a half later, which you can't purchase. Because most likely the owner of the alcohol store did not take it out to be mafkir it, right? And then nobody took it, so they brought it back in. Mm-hmm. So if they didn't do biur, you can't purchase it. Okay, the other challenge is svichim, right? Which is if they're selling vegetables which have prohibition of svichim, you can't eat those either. Mm-hmm. By the way, this is where the challenge of Otzer Beit Din becomes a little bit more serious. According to the Chazon Ish, there's no such thing. Otzer Beit Din's nothing. And so therefore, according to the Chazon Ish, you can't even eat out of pots and pans which were used to cook things which are Otzer Beit Din because the vegetables are all svichim. All the prohibition of svichim. And so until they do Hagala, on their pots and pans, you can't eat food that came out of their pots and pans. So that's where Heter Mechira gets, did I say Otzer Beit Din? Heter Mechira. That's where Heter Mechira gets a little bit trickier, is because according to the Chazon Ish, there is no Heter Mechira, and so therefore the vegetables all have a prohibition of svichim, and people who cook those vegetables in their pots and pans, it's as though they cook svichim in those pots and pans, and they all need Hagala. And also all those things need biur. If you didn't do biur on them, right, there's going to be the same issue on things which were heter mechira.
So if it's nachri, but it's past the time of shvichim, is there a problem?
No, nachri has no prohibition of svichim.
But the idea, the whole question of shvichim was actually really, in a way, Marasayan, in the sense that...
For the Jewish growers, that's why by nachri there's no issue of svichim. Even according to the Mabit, that it has sanctity, there's no issue of svichim by nachri. Mm-hmm. So nachri can sell whatever vegetables you want. Just according to the Beit Yosef, there's no sanctity, and according to the Mabit, there is. But svichim, there's no issue. But the challenge is going to be now, someone who's relying in a store that's relying on heter mechira. If you're going like the Chazon Ish, there is no heter mechira, then all the vegetables, according to the Chazon Ish, will be svichim inside that store, most of them. Right? Eventually, they're all going to be svichim.
The problem with packaged things that you said we're responsible for, can that be solved with hashgachas? Like we know certain hashgachas?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. You look for the hashgacha, and if they have anything surprising to tell you, they'll tell you. They'll write it on the package. If something that you need to know. Absolutely, you rely on hashgacha. Just like you rely on the owner of the store as well. That that he's doing what he needs to be doing and all these things. One just has to be careful with nachri also. If you're buying from like an Arab farmer on the side of the road on the 85 or something like that, you have to know that it was really grown by non-Jews.
Right.
Because he could be selling you...
He's a middleman.
Jewish produce. Right? So you just have to know where it really came from. Okay, we don't have a ton of time. One thing that I just want to mention is just this idea that fruit that has sanctity of the 7th year has to be treated with sanctity, which means that we'll see that oftentimes you cannot just throw it in the garbage can. People should have what's called a Shemita bin, and really, preferably, people should have 2 Shemita bins. I'll explain why in a second. So let's say you eat an apple and you don't want to finish the rest of that apple. There's still some apple, or you don't like eating the apple around the core, so you leave some of the flesh around the core, whatever it is. That has sanctity of the 7th year. So you can't just throw it into your garbage can, because now you're causing, you're disgracing fruit with the sanctity of the 7th year, and possibly even causing it to rot faster and things like that. So therefore, people have what's called the Shemita bin, where they take whatever they didn't use and they put it in the Shemita bin for it to just rot on its own. And the reason why it's recommended to have 2 Shemita bins is if you have fruit which is pretty rotten, you can't now take something fresh and put it in there for the same reason why you can't put it in the garbage can. So people have a Shemita bin for the fresher stuff and the Shemita bin for the more decomposed things, and you can move them one into the other once it starts to decompose and all that. And I guess we'll have to wait for the next time to talk about what exactly needs to go in the Shemita bin and what can go in the garbage and other things. Good. Are there any last second questions before we stop?
I'm still confused about one thing. Let's say you have cucumbers, and during Sukkot, the cucumbers came to fulfillment in the 6th year. During Sukkot, after Sukkot, but while it's still before Svichim time, you make pickles out of them. Right? What is the situation with Bior, with the pickles?
Meaning when there's no more cucumbers left in the field.
There's no more cucumbers in the field, but this is now a pickled cucumber that you've got in your fridge.
Yeah, I don't know how. I mean, you have to. There's dates that they come out with that tell you when Bior happens. I don't know with cucumbers because they're pretty much a year-round.
Well, my point is, I didn't mean to say cucumbers, but anything that you preserve.
You still have to. You still have to take it out during Bior.
So you take it out and you can bring it back in if nobody takes it?
If nobody takes it.
Right.
I mean, the way, I don't know
how long do you have to leave it out?
It's a good question.
Like overnight, or?
No, you don't have to leave it out overnight. Just long enough for someone to be able to come by and take it. So in Yerushalayim, it was sort of like everybody put their stuff out and put a sign that said Hafker, and nobody took it.
Right.
And so you would come back and you would take it back into your house, and that was it. That was the whole beer,
And now you can keep it for the rest of the year.
Now you can keep it. That's
right.
it. You're a mafkir and you're kona it yourself. Okay. You acquired it yourself. You can keep it. How it's going to work in Carmel, I don't know. It's like you have to, look into it a little bit.
You put it out and it's gone.
You could put it out, it might be gone. If you put the word Hafker on it, someone might take it, for sure. But again, it's ownerless fruit, right, from the get-go. Also, it could be that you'll take it out and how long does it take in Carmel for someone to pass by in order to be able to take it? In Yerushalayim, it happens every 5 seconds. It happens pretty quickly. In Carmel, things go a little bit quieter here, so I don't know. It's a little more slow.
Is it preferable to feed your waste apple core, whatever, to a pet, or to throw it in the?
Yeah, sure. If you have if that's something, it should be something that it's at a stage where people wouldn't eat it anymore. This is a stage where people wouldn't eat it anymore, but animals eat it. Or if it's really just the part that only animals eat, right? If you have a goat, you can give it your apple cores for sure. That's great.